This may seem hard to believe, but George R. R. Martin has already told us how The Winds of Winter is going to begin. Of course, it'll begin with a prologue chapter every book in the series has so far, but we know that he plans on opening this novel with a smash. These two massive battles, one in the north with Stannis Baratheon facing down the Frays and Boltons for Winterfell, and one in the far east in Meereen, covered by several viewpoint characters, and bringing all of the plot lines around Daenerys Targaryen to a head in one climactic showdown. In this instance, both of these battles were initially planned to be included in the very end of the previous novel, A Dance with Dragons. We know from Martin's very long discussion post where he details the entire writing and publishing process of this novel that these were eventually cut. One of these cuts was Martin's decision. He found it didn't fit into the ending of the book, while the other was Martin's editor's decision, as A Dance with Dragons was simply getting too long and they just wanted to publish a book. I'll go into which of those I believe was which throughout this video, but today I want to discuss both of those battles and the structure they might implement in The Winds of Winter and what it means for not only the beginning of this novel, but for what these plots could entail going forward. Most of the information we know about this battles comes from parts of them already being semi-published. George R. R. Martin released a lot of sample chapters for The Winds of Winter in the early to mid-2010s, and a number of them concern these battles. It is worth noting that it's very much skewed towards the Battle of Fire rather than the Battle of Ice, those being Meereen and Winterfell respectively. Those are just the names that fans have dubbed them. Specifically, with the battle in Meereen, we have two Tyrion chapters, two Barristan chapters, and half of a Victarion chapter, all of which are dealing with setting up and then getting into the battle itself. This makes me think that the Battle of Fire was the one that Martin had been writing for A Dance with Dragons the longest and had planned to have be the epic climax to that story in that book. And it makes sense given the fact that A Dance with Dragons is so focused on all of these characters kind of convening around Daenerys, and as it ends currently, it is really strange for pretty much all of these characters sailing into Meereen. Tyrion just gets to the city and then the curtain drops. Victarion Greyjoy is sailing in, and while there is a bit of a moment of clarity with him coming to this new religion, really there isn't a clear climactic endpoint. And Barristan Selmy becomes a viewpoint, has 4 chapters, has this climax in Meereen, but then it just kind of ends out of nowhere. The Battle of Ice has had considerably less published material devoted to it. We have the Theon sample chapter, which comes in the back of certain copies of A Dance with Dragons and was released otherwise online. And additionally, we have the Asha fragment, which is a portion of a chapter that is visible on George R. R. Martin's screen when he appears for approximately 3 seconds on an episode of John Oliver from like 2015, because the fandom is very healthy and doing great. This ties into Martin's initial plan for writing these two battles. Specifically, when they were intended to end A Dance with Dragons, Martin's plan was to intercut between these two sequences. Overall, I like that in concept, but I think it works better in theory than it would in practice. Not only do we only have 2 viewpoints on the Battle of Ice as compared to 3 on the Battle of Fire, it seems as though they're pretty lopsided in terms of the scale of each event. The Battle of Ice is just 2 small forces clashing on what is likely to be a lake. I'll get into that a little bit later, and then leading into Stannis' taking of Winterfell, which will be a different kind of event entirely. I don't think it'll take as many chapters as the Battle of Fire will. Battle of Fire has people all over the place. I really like Martin's structure for viewpoints here. We have one viewpoint who is with the slaver forces, who's actually convinced them to join Daenerys, that being Tyrion. We have Victarion out in the bay, seeing the naval combat, and we have Barristan leading Daenerys' forces and the city's defense. If I'm being completely forthright, I think these battles being pushed to the beginning of The Winds of Winter is a big reason as to the book's overall delay. These battles coming at the end of a story makes a lot more sense than opening up another part of the same story, because each book needs to be considered as just that, an individual novel in a larger series. It makes sense to end all of these stories with the climactic battle that they've been building towards, rather than opening up the next story with this battle battle and then leading into its aftermath in the future. Because Martin does tend to kind of remind us, the readers, of what is going on in each story early on in each given book. I've had comments, people saying that he doesn't really do that. I encourage you to read John 1, Danny 1 in A Dance with Dragons. Those chapters are very much catching the reader up on what went on in both of these stories in A Storm of Swords, as they'd previously been absent for about 11 years because they weren't in A Feast for Crows. Let's dive into exactly what those sample chapters tell us. Barristan 1 and 2 are our most direct looks on the Battle of Fire itself, as he is commanding the main bulk of the defending forces in this conflict. His first chapter is effectively him readying his men for battle, giving them a speech, and preparing them to ride out of the city. This is an interesting strategic gambit, as they do have a very strong defensive position within the city, but there is a plague ongoing, the Pale Mare, which is dysentery-like, which is prompting him to kind of take decisive action and end this battle before things get worse inside the city. It's a pretty good chapter. I think it could overall be combined with what we know of the second chapter, but we also don't know the full details of that one, as it was only read once or twice at conventions, and we don't have a full transcription or recording of it. But that chapter largely focuses on Barristan actually getting into the thick of battle. His troops are riding behind him. He ends up fighting against several slave forces, and including an individual known as Little Pigeon, who is one of the leaders of these forces there. And the chapter ends with him noting the arrival of a lot of ships in the bay, and he specifically says that they are krakens, and he thinks that it's strange. He doesn't know why the Greyjoys would be supporting Daenerys. Maybe Theon did this? It's unclear. It is weird, Barristan's perspective on Westeros after being absent for so long, but overall, his chapters are the most direct window into the battle we have so far. Both Tyrion and Victarion's perspectives have thus far only dealt with the lead up to the battles themselves. Specifically, Tyrion has 2 chapters. We actually have a reverse of the Barristan situation. We don't know about his first chapter. We only have fan reports of that. We do have his second chapter. These 2 chapters could 100% just be combined. They are Tyrion playing Syvas, which is Westerosi chess, with Ben Plum, and eventually convincing him and the Second Sons to convert to Daenerys' side after betraying her in A Dance with Dragons. They say they were always the Queen's men. We know that's not true, but we now know that Tyrion is going to be kind of a double agent in this battle and helping Daenerys' forces win the day. Victarion's chapter is also strange. We have a recording of Martin reading half of it. I encourage you to listen to that. It's very fun to listen to, but it is only half the chapter, and it is this kind of preparation for Victarion entering the battle. We hear the plan of having these ships kind of look as though they're just merchant ships, prey for the fleet that is currently blockading Marine, and then once they board those ships, they'll be taken by the Ironborn fully, while Victarion is focusing on blowing this dragon horn and maybe binding a dragon to his will, or Euron's. Who knows? There's another factor in all of this. It's not Quentyn. Quentyn isn't alive, but it is Daenerys. All of these characters are converging around her, and this battle is being waged because of the things she has done in Slaver's Bay. She has been this massive force for good and for change, and the Slavers are striking back against that, and they are likely to lose this battle thanks to Victarion and Tyrion and Barristan. But Daenerys is off on her own into the Dothraki Sea. She flew off towards the end of A Dance with Dragons. She has one more chapter in the Dothraki Sea where she has this excellent internal journey where she is kind of becoming her truest self, and then it ends with her being found by this massive Khalasar. With that said, this was always intended to be the end of Daenerys' story in A Dance with Dragons. We know the Battle of Fire was intended for A Dance with Dragons, so I think that Daenerys is going to be a bit later in the Winds of Winter than anybody expects her to be. I don't think we're going to hear from her again until after the Battle of Fire is concluded, and I think she's going to be away from Marine for a pretty long time. So the characters coming into this situation are going to need to stabilize things and figure out how to rule Marine. Maybe like Tyrion in season 6, but good, hopefully. I also want to ask, of these 2 battles, are you more excited for one than the other? Do you think I've missed anything in my descriptions? Let me know in the comments while you're down there. Leave a like, subscribe, it really helps the video. That is to say, I do think that Daenerys' forces are almost certainly going to be victorious in the Battle of Victorious. Victorian got mixed in there a little bit. I'm going to keep that in. But regardless, I think they're going to win the Battle of Fire. Tyrion switching the Second Sons back to her side is big. Victorian coming with this massive brigade of naval support is also very big. I think that while Barristan's charge will likely spell his own doom for a number of reasons, I have a very old video on that fact, but I think Barristan is very much being set up to die here. I still think that the defense of the city is ultimately going to be successful, as Yunkai is not shown to be the most organized, and I do think their forces are going to end up kind of disintegrating in the face of organized resistance, perhaps organized by Barristan, Tyrion, and Victorian. Though there are complications at play in the battle as well. Specifically, the Victorian is planning on blowing this dragon horn 3 times, and Barristan Selmy's signal to advance his position is blowing a horn 3 times. So a reason that Barristan couldn't end up getting pinned and doomed could be Victorian accidentally calling out and getting his troops out of position. I think that is an idea pitched in Preston Jacobs' Prepping for Winter series, which I love. But overall, I do think that Barristan is also just going into battle with disloyal pit fighters at his back, who he just betrayed and publicly executed one of in a duel. The Battle of Ice is also interesting. As I noted earlier, it is a smaller scale conflict than the Battle of Fire. This isn't the defense of a massive city, this is a battle in a pond in a small village somewhere. But regardless of that, it does have major political implications for the North. We have Theon's sample chapter, which is detailing sort of not only the lay of the land, which is very well set up in Asha's The Sacrifice chapter in A Dance with Dragons, but we get to see both within Stannis' head some of his planning, as well as saying that certain elements of betrayal that were poised to damage Stannis and his campaign have been discovered and rooted out. Most notably the Karstarks, who Stannis gets this letter from Jon and eventually finds out that they are planning on betraying him, so he imprisons all of them. There is a video on this channel that is discussing a very large theory entitled The Night Lamp by user Can't Use, which I fully and completely believe. That is a large theory as to what exactly is going to happen in the Battle of Ice. I don't want to repeat myself too much from that video. I think it holds up, as few of my videos do. But regardless, Stannis' plan seems to be to use a false beacon fire on an island in this lake of ice to lure the Frays and the Manderleys onto the ice, breaking it and causing them all to fall through. This false beacon is foreshadowed earlier on in Davos' chapters in A Dance with Dragons. That is part of why I think this battle was very much intended for A Dance with Dragons, so that setup and follow through is kind of all in one text, rather than being from one to the other. But I digress. That video goes into more details. There are indications from the Asha fragment that things might not go exactly according to plan. Most notably, we can see from Martin's screen that Asha notes that 2 things are quote-unquote rushing together like something, and if this plan were to go off without a hitch, nobody would really be rushing towards each other. We would just have the Frays rushing onto the ice and it breaking underneath them. Another reason I believe these conflicts are going to be kind of opposites is I do think the Battle of Ice is going to be a plan that is executed in one single chapter. The aftermath is going to be even more interesting, in my opinion, as Stannis will still be outside of Winterfell. He will need to get in and claim this castle for his cause to have any hope of succeeding and not starving to death in the snow, though the Fray baggage train might help with that in the short term. The main thought I have seen is that Stannis and his forces will somehow disguise themselves as those Fray and Manderley troops that had been marching against him. The Manderleys are most likely disloyal to the Boltons, given the fact that we know that Manderley was ready to betray for Davos, given Rickon's return, if that was done successfully, and given the fact that we haven't seen Davos in a very long time, it seems likely that off-page he's been able to go to Skagos and bring Rickon back. Though I would like to see that on page. It's unclear if we will. I would like to, but it probably won't happen. These battles are very much a weird way to open the Winds of Winter. There's a very good video about Dungeons and Dragons entitled The Hot Start from Matt Colville's Running the Game series, and it effectively goes through the drawbacks and benefits to beginning your TTRPG campaign, tabletop role-playing game, for those who might not be familiar, in the middle of the action. And there are very much positives and negatives, because it does limit the ways our characters can be introduced to the audience and to each other, but there are ways to kind of hook the reader with the story so immediately, and it can be tricky to establish that opening action with concrete stakes, especially for people who might be opening this book up and who maybe haven't read A Dance with Dragons since it came out in 2011. And beyond that, these are not the only two battles going on at the beginning of the Winds of Winter. Though less focused upon and probably less significant in terms of overall viewpoint and story involvement, the battles of Blood and Steel will also be going on around the beginning of the Winds of Winter. We know that at least one of them will be on page. The Battle of Seal, which is the Golden Company's taking of Storm's End, or possibly defense of Storm's End against the forces of Mace Tyrell, will be on page. Martin has said that he initially planned for it to be off page, but has since changed his mind. I think that'll be another situation like the Battle of Ice, where the actual battle itself is probably one chapter that isn't particularly long. But regardless of that, that's another battle that readers are going to have to contend with very early on in this very action-packed ping-pong match very early on in the Winds of Winter. Beyond that, the Battle of Blood, Euron's fight against the Red Line fleet in the Straits off of Old Town and the Reach, is also an interesting conflict. I do think that it'll be less on page than many readers expect and want, just due to the sheer amount of stuff that is going to need to happen in the beginning of the Winds of Winter. Because that's the thing, these battles happening would be a lot to track even if they were the only things going on in the book. These battles take up about half of our viewpoint characters. The other half all need to be introduced, all need to have their plot lines and character arcs established for this book, and are all doing completely different things in completely different places, and all of them need chapters as well. This is going to be a very overcrowded book in a lot of ways. I do think some viewpoints like Barristan are going to die to kind of thin the herd, though Martin doesn't kill viewpoints as much as people think he does, but overall it is going to be a lot to juggle very early on. There's also a little bit of that old saying going on here that the faintest ink is better than the best memory, given the fact that Martin has had these battles written for probably a decade at this point. We know all of these sample chapters came out fairly soon after A Dance with Dragons was published, and having all of that extra time with this material and knowing Martin, it's undoubtedly led to him rewriting portions of all of these battles again and again and again over the past almost 15 years. Not having them out and published has allowed him to kind of tweak and further perfect things, which is kind of the enemy of having an actual kind of story that is out there for the world to see. I think that all four of these battles have sort of congealed into a new knot for George R.R. Martin. I believe it was almost certainly one of the first things he resolved in terms of his issues with writing The Winds of Winter, but overall, I do think that it did delay things a fair bit, as we know that he was working on that Asha fragment in 2014-2015, which is later than one would think. You'd be working on the very beginning of what is likely to be Asha's first chapter. So overall, I'm excited to see how these end up being finally published, but overall, I think it'll be a very interesting and action-packed way to start the Winds of Winter. Thank you all so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to leave a like and subscribe. I'd really appreciate it, and it does really help grow the channel. I have many more videos on A Song of Ice and Fire, House of the Dragon, and Enter the Seven Kingdoms, and Game of Thrones for you in the very near future, so I hope you'll stay tuned for all of those. I also have a Patreon, which is linked in the description. You can find that there if you want to support me more directly. And yeah, I appreciate you watching the video and watching this far and listening to me ramble at the end, because I don't know, I rarely think about these conclusion sections before I do them, but yeah, I'm just kind of talking here.